The crystal chandeliers of the Rosewood Country Club cast a flawless glow over the charity gala, a night Vivian had meticulously curated down to the last orchid. Everything was picture perfect, except for the shadow of her husband, Julian, standing by the bar. She had explicitly told him he was off the guest list until he apologized for his indiscretion. He hadn't. Yet here he was, radiating an arrogance that suggested he held a secret far more destructive than a simple affair. If you enjoyed deep dives into the dark side of high society marriages, subscribe and stay with us as this story unfolds. The grand ballroom of the Rosewood Country Club hummed with the refined murmur of Boston's elite. Vivian DuPont stood near the towering ice sculpture, her posture as rigid and flawless as the diamonds encircling her throat. She was the architect of this evening, the hospital charity gala that served as the crown jewel of the autumn social season. Every detail, from the exact hue of the velvet drapery to the vintage of the champagne, was under her absolute control, except for the man who had just strolled through the double mahogany doors. Julian St. James, her husband of 7 years, handed his cashmere overcoat to a flustered attendant. He wore a bespoke tuxedo that hugged his broad shoulders, his silver-flecked dark hair immaculately styled. He moved like a devastatingly handsome predator invading a sanctuary he had been explicitly banned from entering. Vivian's knuckles whitened around the stem of her crystal flute. Just yesterday, she had issued the ultimatum in the cold, cavernous space of their penthouse. You are off the guest list until you apologize. It wasn't a demand born of sudden heartbreak, but of required order. The stray hotel receipt she had found in his blazer, a suite booked in the city on a Tuesday afternoon, was an insult to their carefully curated life. She hadn't asked for a tearful confession, merely an acknowledgement of his carelessness and a promise of absolute discretion. A simple apology to restore the balance of their power. He had scoffed, poured himself a scotch, and walked out. Now, watching him glide across the marble floor, charming senators and CEOs with effortless grace, Vivian felt a dangerous heat blooming in her chest. He was mocking her. By refusing to apologize and daring to show his face, Julian was signaling a war she hadn't wanted to fight, but one she absolutely refused to lose. Emily, her closest confidant and fellow board member, leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper over the jazz quartet. I thought you said Julian was grounded in Chicago for the Kingsley and Partners merger? Flights must have opened up, Vivian replied smoothly, forcing a serene smile as she caught her husband's gaze from across the room. Julian raised his glass to her, a slow, predatory smirk playing on his lips. He took a deliberate sip, his eyes never leaving hers, before leaning down to whisper something into the ear of a stunning brunette standing much too close to him. Natalie Pierce. The champagne in Vivian's stomach turned to lead. The missing apology was no longer just about pride. It was a declaration of independence. And as Julian's hand briefly, casually brushed against the small of Natalie's back in a room full of Boston's most powerful gossips, Vivian felt her phone vibrate in her clutch with a new, unsaved photo notification. Vivian slipped her phone from her beaded clutch, shielding the illuminated screen with her palm. The notification was a direct message from an anonymous account. It was a photograph, dimly lit but unmistakable, Julian's hand resting intimately on Natalie Pierce's thigh under a heavy oak table. The timestamp was from barely an hour ago, likely at the Sapphire Lounge right before they arrived at the gala. The sheer audacity of it made the air in Vivian's lungs turn to glass. He wasn't just refusing to apologize. He was actively taunting her, testing the tensile strength of her pride. Vivian, darling, the floral arrangements are simply divine this year, drawled Mark Stevens, a senior partner at Julian's firm, pulling her attention back to the glittering ballroom. She locked her phone away, pasting on a smile so practiced it felt carved into her porcelain skin. Thank you, Mark. The white orchids represent the purity of the Foundation's mission. Her voice was a smooth, velvet ribbon wrapping around a razor blade. Across the room, Julian was holding court. He stood near the towering arched windows that overlooked the manicured greens of the golf course, a heavy crystal glass of bourbon in his hand. Natalie was ostensibly engaged in conversation with a young tech mogul, but her body language was a dead giveaway to anyone fluent in the silent language of Boston's upper crust. The delicate tilt of her head, the way her bare shoulder angled instinctively toward Julian, the brief, heavy glances they exchanged, it was a performance of intimacy designed to be recognized by those paying attention. Vivian moved through the crowd, greeting millionaire donors and kissing powdered cheeks, her mind working like a furious, cold calculator. If she stormed over and demanded he leave, she would be branded the hysterical, jealous wife, the ultimate punchline of tomorrow's country club brunches. Her reputation, the impenetrable armor she had meticulously forged since marrying into the St. James Empire, would crack. But if she did nothing, she effectively endorsed his disrespect. She would be relegated to the role of the blind, tolerant spouse, a fate she despised more than death itself. She chose the only weapon immediately available, calculated proximity. Gliding toward his inner circle, she smoothly inserted herself beside him, linking her arm through his with an iron, unforgiving grip. "Julian," she purred, her tone perfectly modulated for the surrounding audience. "I didn't expect you to make it back from Chicago. What a pleasant surprise." Julian stiffened marginally, though his handsome face betrayed nothing. He looked down at her, his dark eyes glittering with a dangerous, unspoken challenge. "I couldn't miss your night of triumph, Vivian. You know how much I value our public commitments." "Indeed," she murmured, her manicured nails pressing a fraction of an inch into his tuxedo jacket, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the wool. She turned her icy gaze to the brunette, standing mere inches away. "Natalie, how lovely of you to come. I trust you're finding the champagne to your liking?" Natalie's glossy smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a fleeting crack in her own polished veneer. The air between the three of them grew heavy, suffocating, and charged with the electric hum of a bomb counting down. Vivian's grip on Julian's arm did not loosen until they crossed the threshold of the darkened VIP lounge, an opulent enclave usually reserved for platinum donors. Tonight, it was blissfully empty, the heavy mahogany doors shutting out the jazz quartet and the ceaseless, glittering chatter of the ballroom. The silence that descended between them was immediate and venomous. Releasing him, she smoothed the front of her emerald gown, a deliberate gesture of realigning her armor. "I told you, Julian. You were off the guest list until you apologized. And yet, you chose to humiliate me by parading your distraction in front of half the firm." Julian walked over to the tufted leather sofa, unbuttoning his tuxedo jacket with a frustrating nonchalance. "Humiliate you? Vivian, nobody knows anything unless you make a scene. Natalie is a junior partner at Kingsley & Partners. Her presence here is entirely justifiable. Do not insult my intelligence." Vivian's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. She thought of the anonymous photo currently burning a hole in her digital inbox. "You think you are untouchable. You think a Tuesday afternoon hotel suite and a hand under a table at the Sapphire Lounge go unnoticed in this city." Julian paused, a microscopic flicker of surprise crossing his handsome features before his arrogant smirk returned. He poured himself a splash of scotch from the crystal decanter on the side table. "So you have spies. How theatrical." "I have eyes," she corrected coldly, "and I demanded a modicum of respect." A private apology was the absolute minimum required to maintain our equilibrium. Taking a slow, deliberate sip, Julian leaned against the mahogany-paneled wall. "I won't apologize for living my life, Vivian. We have an arrangement, whether you want to admit it aloud or not." He gestured between them with his heavy glass. "Our marriage is an acquisition, a merger of the DuPont Trust and the St. James portfolios. You wouldn't dare blow that up over bruised pride." He was referring to the prenup, a brutal, ironclad document they had signed 7 years ago. It essentially guaranteed mutually assured destruction if either filed for divorce, tying their joint assets in legal purgatory for decades unless one party willingly forfeited their shares. Julian felt entirely safe behind that fortress of legalese. He believed she loved her wealth and her status far more than she hated his infidelity. Vivian stared at him, her pulse steadying into a cold, rhythmic drumbeat. He thought she was merely a slighted wife throwing a tantrum. He had no idea that her silence over the past few months hadn't been submission. It had been meticulous, quiet preparation. Let him mock the prenup. Let him believe it was his impenetrable shield. "You are right about one thing," Vivian murmured, her eyes dark and completely unreadable. "We are a merger." Julian set his glass down, looking faintly victorious, and adjusted his platinum cufflinks. "Enjoy your gala, darling. Try to smile for the cameras." As the heavy door clicked shut behind him, Vivian stood alone in the dim, quiet room. She reached into her clutch, bypassing the scandalous photo, and opened a highly encrypted email thread on her phone. The subject line from her private wealth manager read, *offshore reallocation complete. She typed a single word in reply, *execute. Stepping out of the dimly lit VIP lounge, Vivian was immediately assaulted by the brilliance of the crystal chandeliers and the sweeping melody of a Strauss waltz. She smoothed her features into a mask of serene indifference, preparing to re-enter the battlefield. But before she could take 3 steps toward the main floor, her phone vibrated against her palm. It was a rhythmic, relentless buzzing, a flurry of notifications that felt like a physical warning against her skin. Retreating into the alcove behind a towering marble pillar, she unlocked the screen. It wasn't another anonymous direct message. It was a tag on a private, highly exclusive social media ring followed by Boston's most influential elites. Emily, her loyal confidant, had forwarded it to her with a single, panicked question mark. Vivian tapped the link. A carousel of high-resolution images loaded, devastating in their vibrant clarity. It was Julian and Natalie, not hidden in a dark corner of a lounge, but sun-drenched on the teak deck of a yacht in Martha's Vineyard. The timestamp was glaringly obvious. It was from the previous month, the exact weekend Julian had sworn he was locked in tense boardroom negotiations in London. The final slide was a short, damning video snippet. Julian laughing, pulling Natalie by the waist, and pressing an intimate kiss to her bare shoulder. The air in Vivian's lungs crystallized into ice. The sheer, unadulterated recklessness of it was staggering. Julian wasn't just having an affair. He was actively dismantling the fortress of their reputation out of pure, arrogant negligence. Her manicured thumb hovered over the illuminated screen. The dilemma was immediate and sharp. She could text her crisis management team, summon a digital blackout, and bury the leak under a mountain of aggressive cease and desist letters before it infected the entire ballroom. That was what the old Vivian would have done. She would have bled herself dry to protect the St. James legacy. But as she watched the view count on the video tick rapidly upward, a glacial calm washed over her. This public humiliation was the missing piece on the chessboard. Julian relied blindly on their ironclad prenup, confident that their mutual greed would forever prevent a divorce. What he had forgotten, or perhaps, in his hubris, never bothered to read, was the obscure morality and public disgrace clause she had meticulously embedded during the firm's corporate restructuring 3 months ago. A clause that triggered a total forfeiture of his shares in the event of a documented, scandalous breach of marital duty. He had signed the dense legal paperwork without a second glance, trusting his wife's flawless financial acumen. He had thought her quiet acceptance of his late nights was submission. A sudden, distinct shift in the room's ambient noise pulled Vivian from her thoughts. A quiet murmur rippled through the nearest cluster of guests. Vivian looked up. Across the ballroom, several prominent wives were huddled over glowing screens, their eyes darting conspicuously toward Julian. The Whisper network was alive. The digital poison was already in the water. Julian, oblivious to the shifting tide, began walking toward the stage, preparing to deliver the gala's keynote speech. Vivian slipped her phone back into her clutch, her lips curving into a terrifyingly serene smile. Let him speak. A hush fell over the grand ballroom of the Rosewood Country Club as Julian St. James stepped confidently onto the raised dais. The spotlight caught the subtle silver in his dark hair, framing his impossibly handsome features in a halo of power and authority. He tapped the microphone lightly, the sharp sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Vivian remained anchored near the marble pillar, her posture flawless. Around her, she could feel the subtle shift in the room's energy. The murmurs had quieted, replaced by an electric, almost predatory stillness. Half the guests in attendance were likely refreshing their phones under the tables, devouring the leaked photos of his vineyard escapade. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, and friends of the Foundation, Julian began, his voice a rich, resonant baritone that easily commanded attention. Tonight is a testament to what we can achieve when we build together, when we commit to a shared vision. He paused, allowing his charismatic smile to sweep across the crowd. It was a practiced, lethal charm that had closed billion-dollar deals and, apparently, unhooked silk dresses on yachts. He met the eyes of the prominent donors, oblivious to the fact that their polite applause was now heavily laced with venomous curiosity. Then, his gaze found Vivian. A slow, deliberate smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was a private challenge, a psychological power play broadcast to 500 people. He was using the stage to force her hand, testing the tensile strength of her pride. Of course, none of this would be possible without the relentless dedication and unyielding support of my beautiful wife, Vivian, Julian continued, extending a hand gracefully in her direction. She is the true architect of tonight's success, the silent force behind the St. James legacy. Vivian, darling, please, join me. The silence in the room suddenly felt sharp and dangerous. A few heads snapped toward her, waiting. The implication was clear, submit. Walk up here and play the dutiful, adoring wife, or cause a scene that will destroy everything you've built. He was daring her to flinch under the weight of his public demand and the silent judgment of the elite. Vivian's chest felt tight, the air thin. The dilemma was agonizingly simple. She could stand frozen, radiating icy defiance, and let the whispers consume her alive. Or she could ascend the steps, take his arm, and solidify her role as the oblivious, cuckolded spouse while he basked in the spotlight. Her eyes flicked briefly toward a shadowy alcove near the exit. Standing there, nursing a flute of champagne with an expression of faint triumph, was Natalie Pierce. The young junior partner offered a microscopic, mocking tilt of her glass. A glacial calm settled over Vivian's racing heart. The trap was set. The legal mechanisms were already in motion. All she needed to do was deliver the killing blow, and a premature explosion of rage would only muddy the narrative. She needed Julian completely relaxed, entirely convinced of his own invincibility. Lifting her chin, Vivian produced a smile, so radiantly serene it could have been carved from diamond. She smoothed the emerald silk of her gown and began a slow, deliberate walk toward the stage. The crowd parted for her like water, the silence deafening. She ascended the 3 steps with terrifying grace, extending her hand to meet his outstretched one. Julian's grip was firm, slightly triumphant, pulling her close to his side. "To my wife," he murmured into the microphone, his thumb subtly stroking her knuckles. Vivian leaned in close, her lips brushing the shell of his ear, her voice a lethal, silken whisper meant only for him. "Enjoy the view, Julian." Vivian's smile did not waver as she stood beside Julian, the brilliant spotlight illuminating the sudden, sharp tension between them. Her whispered promise lingered in the air, a drop of poison in his champagne. The crowd of Boston's elite watched, breathless, sensing the microscopic fracture in the flawless St. James facade. Julian's confident grip on her hand faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes, dark and assessing, swept over her face, searching for the meaning behind her words. He leaned into the microphone to continue his speech, but Vivian was faster. With a movement so smooth it appeared choreographed, she slid her hand free and stepped in front of him, claiming the center of the dais. The microphone stand was suddenly hers. "Thank you, Julian." Vivian's voice rang out, clear and crystalline, completely devoid of the tremor he likely expected. The murmurs in the ballroom ceased entirely. "It is true. I am the architect of tonight's success. But my work extends far beyond the floral arrangements and the silent auctions. She let her gaze drift over the sea of faces, the senators, the CEOs, the wealthy socialites whose phones were likely still warm from the scandalous photos of Martha's Vineyard. Finally, her eyes locked onto Natalie Pierce, still standing near the exit. The young woman's smirk had vanished, replaced by a sudden, wary stillness. For 7 years, Vivian continued, her tone conversational but sharp enough to draw blood. My husband and I have built an empire on the foundation of a very specific arrangement. A merger, as he so fondly calls it. An ironclad agreement designed to protect the DuPont Trust and the St. James portfolios. Julian shifted uncomfortably behind her. Vivian, he murmured, a low, warning note vibrating in his chest. Not here. She ignored him entirely. Many of you in this room understand the complexities of such a partnership. The sacrifices, the blind eyes turned to certain afternoon indiscretions. A collective gasp rippled through the front tables. Emily, seated near the stage, pressed a hand to her mouth. Vivian saw Mark Stevens's face drain of color. But an empire requires discipline. Vivian's voice hardened, the velvet slipping to reveal the steel beneath. It requires discretion. And most importantly, it requires reading the fine print of the corporate restructuring documents you sign. Julian froze. The confident, arrogant posture he had held all evening vanished, replaced by a sudden, rigid tension. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to cut the microphone feed, but the sound engineer, bribed handsomely by Vivian an hour ago, remained perfectly still. You see, Vivian projected her voice, letting the icy satisfaction bleed through. When Julian refused a simple, private apology for his rather public carelessness with Ms. Pierce over the past few months, he assumed our prenup was his shield. He assumed I was merely a slighted wife who would never risk her wealth for pride. She turned slowly, facing her husband. The look of dawning horror in Julian's eyes was more intoxicating than any vintage champagne. You forgot the morality and public disgrace clause, Julian. The one activated the moment those photos of you and Natalie on the yacht went viral 10 minutes ago. The ballroom erupted. The silence shattered into a chaotic storm of gasps, hurried whispers, and the frantic clicking of cameras as guests abandoned all pretense of politeness. Every share of Kingsley and Partners. Vivian leaned in, her voice dropping to a lethal purr that the microphone barely caught, but the entire room seemed to feel. Every asset tied to the St. James name is currently being frozen and reallocated to the DuPont Trust. The grand ballroom of the Rosewood Country Club had transformed from a sanctuary of elite philanthropy into an arena of spectacular, unrestrained carnage. Vivian stood bathed in the harsh glare of the spotlight, her emerald gown catching the light like armor. Around her, the manicured silence of Boston's upper crust had shattered completely. Cell phones were raised like weapons, recording the unprecedented implosion of the St. James Empire in real time. Julian stared at her, the color draining from his face, leaving behind an ashen, terrifying pallor. The baritone confidence that had commanded boardrooms and charmed his way into hotel suites was gone, replaced by a raw, naked disbelief. His eyes, usually dark pools of arrogance, darted frantically from Vivian's serene, diamond-hard expression to the faces of his colleagues in the front row. You're lying, he hissed, his voice raw and stripped of its usual smooth cadence. He stepped forward, grabbing her wrist with a force that sent a sharp spike of pain up her arm. Turn off that microphone, Vivian. Stop this immediately. She didn't flinch. Her pulse was steady, cold, and triumphant. Lying? She countered, her voice ringing out, clear and uncompromising over the mounting chaos. She wrenched her arm free, a deliberate, violent motion that drew a collective intake of breath from the nearest tables. I don't need to lie, Julian. The truth is already circulating in high definition. She turned slightly, addressing the crowd again. I believe many of you have seen the footage by now. The Martha's Vineyard trip? The one my husband claimed was a crucial negotiation in London? It appears he was closing a very different kind of deal with our junior partner, Miss Pierce. At the mention of her name, the attention of 500 people snapped toward the exit. Natalie Pierce stood frozen, her champagne flute hanging limply from her hand. The smug, microscopic tilt of her head was gone, replaced by the wide, terrified eyes of a woman realizing she had just been sacrificed on the altar of a much larger, much more dangerous game. Several wives seated near her audibly scooted their chairs away, the social contagion of the scandal already isolating her. Mark Stevens, Julian's senior partner, stood up, his face a mottled, furious red. "Julian, is this true? Is this about the restructuring clause?" He barked, his voice cutting through the din. The implications were catastrophic. If Julian had forfeited his shares due to a morality breach, the entire hierarchy of Kingsley and Partners was about to collapse. Julian spun toward Mark, his hands raised in a placating gesture that looked entirely desperate. "Mark, no. Listen to me. She's hysterical. She's misinterpreting a legal technicality." "A technicality?" Vivian laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that chilled the air. She reached into her clutch and withdrew a folded piece of thick, crested paper. It was the executive summary of the reallocation order, signed and countersigned by her wealth manager not 20 minutes ago. She held it up, not for Julian to read, but for the room to witness. "This is not a technicality. This is execution. You thought our marriage was a merger, Julian? You were right. But you failed to realize that I was the acquiring entity. And tonight, the board has voted you out." The sheer audacity of her move, weaponizing their ironclad prenup against him, turning his infidelity from a private humiliation into a public, financial guillotine, left the room reeling. The power dynamic had shifted so violently it felt as though the floor itself had tilted. "You planned this," Julian breathed, the realization finally breaking through his panic. His chest heaved beneath his bespoke tuxedo. "You knew about Natalie. You knew for months. You let me stand up here." "I let you hang yourself," Vivian corrected softly, leaning closer so only he could hear the final, lethal whisper. "I asked for one thing, Julian. A private apology. A small concession to my pride. But you couldn't do it. Your ego wouldn't allow it. So now, you will pay for your arrogance with everything you own." She didn't wait for his response. Turning her back on him, Vivian DuPont walked off the dais. The crowd parted for her once more, no longer with polite deference, but with a stunned, terrified reverence. She left Julian standing alone under the spotlight, a ruined king amidst the ashes of his own making, the sound of his empire collapsing echoing through the silent, glittering ballroom. The elevator doors of the ivory tower slid open with a soft, expensive chime. Vivian stepped out into the cavernous foyer of the penthouse, the silence of the space hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Hours ago, this had been a battleground where she had demanded a simple apology. Now, it was a museum of a dead marriage. She walked slowly across the wide expanse of Italian marble, the heels of her emerald pumps clicking in a rhythmic, lonely staccato. The panoramic windows offered a sweeping, glittering view of Boston, oblivious to the fact that the St. James Empire had just been publicly decapitated. Dropping her beaded clutch onto the glass console table, she felt the adrenaline that had fueled her through the gala begin to drain, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. She had won. The war was over. Julian's frantic voicemails and the panicked texts from Kingsley and Partners board members were already flooding her phone, desperate attempts to salvage the wreckage she had orchestrated. Natalie Pierce's career was ashes, and Julian's reputation as an untouchable titan was irrevocably shattered. But as she moved into the darkened living room, the sheer scale of the devastation settled over her like a heavy shroud. She traced the edge of the tufted leather sofa where Julian had sat yesterday, scoffing at her ultimatum. He had been so arrogant, so blindly confident in his invincibility and the protection of their ironclad prenup. A silver tray on the wet bar held a half-empty crystal decanter of scotch and a single, unwashed glass. Julian's glass. Vivian picked it up, the faint scent of his cologne and expensive liquor still lingering on the rim. The reality of what she had done crystallized. She had protected the DuPont trust. She had maintained her terrifying, absolute dominance over Boston's social elite. She had ensured that no one would ever look at her with the pity reserved for a cuckolded wife. Yet, she was utterly alone in a fortress of her own making. She walked toward the heavy mahogany desk in the corner of the room, her movements stiff and mechanical. Sitting in the high-backed leather chair, she opened the top drawer and withdrew a thick manila envelope. The legal team had delivered it that afternoon, right before she began dressing for the gala. Vivian slid the documents out. The bold, unyielding font of the divorce petition stared back at her. It wasn't just a legal separation. It was a total asset seizure, a meticulously planned financial execution triggered by the morality clause she had weaponized tonight. Every account, every property, the very penthouse she sat in, it all belonged to her now. Julian would be left with a fraction of his worth, his pride pulverized, his name synonymous with absolute scandal. She picked up a gold fountain pen from the desk. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the quiet of luxury. It was the ringing, deafening silence of a battlefield after the artillery had stopped. She thought of Julian's face under the spotlight, the dawning horror, the shattered ego. She thought of the 7 years they had spent building a flawless facade, mistaking a corporate merger for a life together. With a steady, uncompromising hand, Vivian signed her name on the final line of the petition. The scratch of the nib against the heavy paper sounded loud in the empty room. As she lifted the pen, a single, hot tear slipped free, landing directly beside her signature, blurring the blue ink into a dark, permanent stain. She stared down at the ruined document, the weight of her Pyrrhic victory pressing against her chest. She had burned down the entire world to punish his pride, and now she would have to live in the ashes. Vivian closed the envelope, her voice a fragile, echoing whisper in the dark. We protected the empire, Julian, but we burned the throne.